Hey guys, it's Morgan, and this is now a Nabokov channel. I have read at this point all or nearly all of Vladimir Nabokov's English language works. That means these novels plus Speak Memory, a bunch of his poems, his short stories, his essays, his interviews, and just other stuff that he's written or said. This guy has clearly dominated my intellectual life for the past year. Sometimes I lie in bed and just think about Vladimir Nabokov. It's not just me, though. There are multiple international societies of Nabokov fans and devotees, people who spend their time reading and rereading his works, discussing them, and just poring over every little detail they can find in anything he's ever written. And now I, too, am officially among their number. So as I've been reading and rereading Vladimir Nabokov, I've been trying to consolidate my thoughts and drill down to the key takeaways, the big themes that define Vladimir Nabokov's corpus, or at least my experience of reading Vladimir Nabokov. And that is going to be the subject of today's video. I want to present a sort of guide to Vladimir Nabokov's big themes so that if you're just getting into Nabokov, or maybe you've read some of his works but want to place his books into a bigger structure or analysis, I'm hoping I can distill what I've learned from reading a lot of Nabokov into just 3 big themes. What do I mean by theme? These are just the topics, the ideas that he returns to again and again. These are the things I think undergird a lot of his writing. I'm going to present the theme, and then I'm going to walk through some of the variations of that theme as it shows up in individual novels. As for spoilers, well, I'm going to be talking about the thematic material from 8 or 9 books. So if you consider theme to be an important part of a book, yeah, there may be spoilers here, but I'm going to try not to spoil any major plot points. So let's get into it. The first big theme is Russia. Kind of obvious, right? Well, this theme encompasses the sub-themes of being in exile, being isolated from mainstream society, having a strong sense of nostalgia, and the theme of the mutability of memory and the fallibility of memory. And of course, this stems from Nabokov's own early life experience of having grown up in the lap of luxury, basically as a Russian aristocrat, and then having it all stripped away from him irrevocably in an instant in the Russian Revolution. A lot of his books revolve around Russian émigrés, Russians living in Western Europe and America. The most concrete example of this is in The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, which is a book about a Russian émigré, Sebastian Knight, but he's taken on an English personality. He's living in England with an English name. He's started writing books in English, and he even has an English fiancée. However, throughout the book, hints and trickles of Russianness come into the picture of who Sebastian Knight was. This book is written by V, Sebastian's half-brother, after Sebastian has died. The conflict and confusion between Sebastian's English identity and his Russian identity is a key plot point in the book. I love this part towards the beginning of the book when V is burning Sebastian's papers. As I was burning them in the grate, one sheet of the blue became loose, curving backwards under the torturing flame, and before the crumpling blackness had crept over it, a few words appeared in full radiance, then swooned, and all was lost. I sank down in an armchair and mused for some moments. The words I had seen were Russian words, part of a Russian sentence, quite insignificant in themselves, really. Not that I might have expected from the flame of chance the slick intent of a novelist's plot. The literal English translation would be, "Thy manner always to find," and it was not the sense that struck me, but the mere fact of its being in my language. This kicks off a chase by V, and by extension, you, the reader, of elements of Russianness in Sebastian's outwardly English identity. There is a persistent leitmotif in this book of mistaken identity. It's funny in a characteristically Nabokovian way. V will try to interview people who once knew Sebastian or who might have known Sebastian, and he will introduce Sebastian always as an English gentleman, an English writer, but that English identity doesn't always get across to the interviewer. And right up until the last page, there is still confusion between whether Sebastian is an Englishman or a Russian. So the real life of Sebastian Knight is about how the individual is perceived from the outside versus how they are to themselves. And in that sense, it's kind of banal. It would be pretty first order stuff to just portray a character that has trouble fitting in after they move to a foreign country. I think the novel that really shows the interior life of the exile is Pinin. If the real life of Sebastian Knight is the Russian exile in Europe, Pinin is the Russian exile in America. And the main character of Pinin is not just further away in distance from Mother Russia, he's also further away in time. Pinin takes place after World War II, and the real life of Sebastian Knight takes place between the two world wars. There is plenty of poignancy and not a little humor in watching Pinin struggle with the English language, struggle to connect to his colleagues and with his kind of adopted son. The guy is clearly an exile. But I think one of the most interesting ways that Nabokov shows us his exileness is when Pinin realizes that he can't rescue a memory he has from old Russia in his new life in America. The scene takes place in the Wayndell College library when something reminds Pinin of a Russian translation of Hamlet. But then he realizes that he can't check because the library doesn't have that Russian version. Of course, Ophelia's death, Hamlet, in good old Andrei Cronenberg's Russian translation, 1844, the joy of Pinin's youth and of his father's and grandfather's young days. And here, as in the Kostromskoy passage, there is, we recollect, also a willow and also wreaths. But where to check properly? Alas, Gamlet, Williama Shakespeare, had not been acquired by Mr. Todd, was not represented in Wayndell College Library, and whenever you were reduced to look up something in the English version, you never found this or that beautiful, noble, sonorous line that you remembered all your life from Cronenberg's text in Vengerov's splendid edition. Sad! It's funny, but it's also really sad. And I think this moment was one of the most painful consequences of Vladimir Nabokov's exile from Russia. He always insisted that he never needed to go back to the USSR, that he had all of Russia that he needed in him, aka its language and his own memories, his childhood. But this passage reveals the vulnerability in that line of thought, because the moment you forget and are unable to recollect something, that's the moment when you know you're truly unable to go back home. As an aside, this passage also brings up one of Nabokov's favorite topoi, this idea of a character having a reality in their head that may be pretty niche, and in this case it's a memory, but nevertheless that memory is very much alive in their head. It just doesn't jive with the contemporary and present local reality around them. We'll come back to this later. So this Russia theme is the most straightforward of the three themes that I've identified in Nabokov, and I think it's the most relatable. A lot of us have felt like exiles or isolated from mainstream society at some point in our lives, or feel like we're constantly having to shore up our memories because we can never go back home. For Nabokov, I think he tried to immortalize his memories through art. And I think Speak Memory is the obvious best example of this. In this book, he recalls Russia with extreme tenderness. He just recalls his life with a loving attention to detail. The last chapter of this book is super explicit about that nostalgic longing. They are passing post haste, the gliding years, to use a soul-rending Horatian inflection. The years are passing, my dear, and presently nobody will know what you and I know. Our child is growing. The roses of Paestum, of misty Paestum, are gone. There are references in here to a Horatian ode, to the roses of Paestum, which is a classical byword for death and the transience of things. Nabokov seems really concerned with remembering things in general. And one time-tested way to remember things is to set it down in words. No matter if the memory is pleasant or painful or morally repugnant, Nabokov wants to remember it. I'll just put here the last line of Lolita, which sums up this artistic philosophy of Nabokov's. I am thinking of aurochs and angels, the secret of durable pigments, prophetic sonnets, the refuge of art. And this is the only immortality you and I may share, my Lolita. The second big theme in Nabokov's works is reality is not real. Nabokov had a very particular view of reality. He has been known to repeat that reality is the only word that should always appear in quotation marks. And he's also said that you can get nearer and nearer, so to speak, to reality, but you can never get near enough because reality is an infinite succession of steps, levels of perception, false bottoms, and hence unquenchable, unattainable. Okay, now what do you mean by this? In simplest terms, Nabokov believes that reality is filtered through the consciousness and interpretation of every individual observer. So there is no such thing as objective reality. Every Nabokov novel plays with this to some extent by having a central character construct his own world out of some objective phenomenon, but also out of a lot of art. And I'm using art not in the sense of aesthetic beauty, but in the sense of ars artis, a skill, device, the sense of artifice or artificial, something that's the opposite of chance. According to Nabokov, reality can only be understood through art. One of my favorite little episodes that shows this idea is in Pale Fire, and this book overall is the best example of reality not being real in a Nabokov work. Reading this book will make you question if everything that you've read so far has been real or if it's been all delusion. It has one of Nabokov's most famous examples of an unreliable narrator. But the scene that I'm talking about is where Nabokov describes a painting in the Zemplin Palace by a painter named Eystein. He says, in some of these portraits, Eystein had also resorted to a weird form of trickery. Among his decorations of wood or wool, gold or velvet, he would insert one which was really made of the material elsewhere imitated by paint. So instead of painting a wooden pattern on something, the guy would just insert a piece of wood into the painting. And in fact, there is one such painting in the Zemplin Palace of a guy holding a bronze box, but the side of the box has a piece of actual bronze inlaid into it. In the story, this tricks two Soviet agents who are kind of ransacking the palace into thinking that there's treasure in the box behind that piece of bronze. But the narrator sees through this and he disparages this device of Eystein. He says, this device, which was apparently meant to enhance the effect of his tactile and tonal values, had, however, something ignoble about it and disclosed not only an essential flaw in Eystein's talent, but the basic fact that reality is neither the subject nor the object of true art, which creates its own special reality having nothing to do with the average reality perceived by the communal eye. In other words, the artist must interpret, and the lack of interpretation by slavish mimesis that is betrayed by this technique is actually a weakness in the art. It may be enough to fool two Soviet Philistines who are only out for material gain, but Nabokov punishes them too because in the story, those two Soviets look behind the piece of bronze, but they don't find anything of value. This little anecdote has a meta level of irony to it as well, because the narrator of this section, Kinbote, doesn't realize, like most Nabokovian narrators, how the principle that he just espoused applies to himself. True art creates its own special reality, having nothing to do with the communal reality. Is that not what Kinbote is himself doing with his whole Zembla shtick? In real life, we call people who create their own special reality lunatics. And that is what a lot of us will be calling Kinbote by reading this book. But if we take this axiom one step further and posit that Kinbote actually knows what he's doing, is not the created reality, the illusion, more artistic and more valuable than the actual objective reality, which Kinbote appears to reject? Yeah, this is why Pale Fire is the best example of reality bending in Nabokov. But this is not the only example where reality gets bent. In some books, it's so obvious that it's kind of like the entire point of the book. In Ada or Ardor, it's a distorted mirror reality of our world. They call it anti-terra. And in Look at the Harlequins, it's a distorted mirror of Nabokov's own life. And of course, you can look at the multiple, plentiful examples of unreliable narrators in Nabokov. Obviously, in Lolita, there's the sovereign example of an unreliable narrator, and in Pale Fire itself, as with Kinbote. The one sub-theme of reality is not real that I would like to draw attention to here is the frequent appearance in Nabokov of supernatural phenomena or super real phenomena. The guy was clearly interested in the afterlife. And in fact, that's what his wife, Vera Nabokov, said was her husband's main theme. What I mean by supernatural phenomena is the existence of an idea of fate or an unseen power playing with the characters or controlling them, or hints as to the existence of another world beyond the world of the book, and even sometimes ghosts or just messages from the beyond. I think Nabokov used supernatural phenomena in his works as a way to bend reality. His works are essentially set in the real world. He was a modernist writer. He wasn't a magical realist, but a lot of times at the climax of his novels, reality will distort. The characters will do things that don't make sense. Things seem to be taking place in a dream. And in one case, the author breaks through the fourth wall. Examples of reality distorting include the end of Transparent Things, the end of Ben Sinister, and of course that crazy climax in Lolita. A lot of Nabokov main characters question their own sanity. A lot of them go crazy at the end of their novel because they kind of can't bear the testing of reality that happens to them throughout the course of the book. And those who don't go crazy at least wind up thinking that there might be some higher power controlling them. And of course, this is an instance of Nabokov playing tricks on them and on us, because there is no such thing as fate in a novel. Fate in a novel has a name, and that is the author. So this brings me to the last theme in Vladimir Nabokov, and that is interactivity. Reading Vladimir Nabokov demands a lot of the reader. It demands that the reader be really engaged and interactive with the text. I return again and again to this quote from Nabokov's Lectures on Literature. Literature, real literature, must not be gulped down like some potion which may be good for the heart or good for the brain. Nabokov does not want readers to turn off their brain. He doesn't want readers to lose themselves in a book or identify with a character. He never wants you to forget that this is a created work that you're holding in your hands. As I already mentioned, there are moments where he breaks reality and there is an author avatar there, but more often in his novels, the narrators of those novels are in universe, aware to some extent that they have a readership and audience. So the narrator of Pale Fire is explicitly writing a literary commentary. The narrator of Ada or Ardor is reading or rereading his autobiography. The narrator of The Real Life of Sebastian Knight is writing a book explicitly about Sebastian Knight. And of course, Lolita, the narrator there, is writing his account from prison as a sort of monument to his love. These people aren't just telling their stories into the wind. They are aware of us as readers and are trying to communicate something to us and are expecting us to do a little bit of the work. I think the main way Nabokov demands interactivity is through his use of patterns or planting of patterns. He will plant ideas, images, signs, and symbols, although he would have balked to hear me say that of him. But he will nevertheless plant those symbols starting from the first page of a book. And then later at a climactic passage, he will call back to those signs and symbols. And then you can have this magical moment of understanding and realization through his subtle interweaving of these threads of symbols throughout the entire course of the book. It's super satisfying to get one of those callbacks in a climactic passage, but it demands that the reader has paid attention throughout the book. I will use an example from Lolita of one such eureka moment. Waterproof. Why did a flash from Hourglass Lake cross my consciousness? I too had known it without knowing it all along. There was no shock, no surprise. Quietly, the fusion took place, and everything fell into order, into the pattern of branches that I have woven throughout this memoir with the express purpose of having the ripe fruit fall at the right moment. Yes, the express and perverse purpose of rendering, she was talking, but I sat melting in my golden peace, of rendering that golden and monstrous peace through the satisfaction of logical recognition, which my most inimical reader should experience now. I don't know about you, but the first time I read Lolita, I did not know what the hell he was talking about because I just wasn't paying attention. Sorry, I'm not as smart as you, Vladimir. But Nabokov kind of presupposes and demands that a reader pay attention. He wants you to pick up what he's putting down, so to speak. After reading this passage, I had to go back through the beginning of the book and try to figure out what references and clues he's been dropping. And that's just one way that Nabokov demands interactivity. Another way that Nabokov demands interactivity from the reader is through the intrusion of the real world, like our world here, tokens of Vladimir Nabokov himself. So I mean references, for example, to the book Lolita in other subsequent novels of his, or references to characters whose names start with V, which is a reference to Vladimir himself, and also references to doppelgangers, doubles of himself, events in his life, but with a crueler twist on them. This comes across most clearly, I think, in his books about Russian émigrés, because there he's borrowing directly from his own life, and it behooves the reader to be able to get those references, to be able to pick up those tokens. And in that sense, it really helps to have read speak memory. The last way I want to talk about how Nabokov demands interactivity is just through his language. The guy was smart. He knew his French, he knew his Russian, he knew his English literature, he knew his classics, and he knew a shit ton about science as well. So in order to pick up the full meaning of what he's talking about, you often have to go digging. And I'm talking about dictionaries, Wikipedia, geography, botany, literary and historical references. I studied classics in college, so I kind of grew up revering the illusion. And so this aspect of reading Nabokov really tickles my fancy, but even I am not always in the mood to look up every other sentence. I got so sick and tired of looking up French and Russian on every single page in Ada or Ardor that it stalled my reading of that book for months. And let's just look up a random page in Ada or Ardor and see what languages are on it. French, German, French, French, Russian, Russian, Russian. Okay, there were 3 instances of Russian, 1 instance of German, and 4 instances of French on those 2 pages alone. Flashbacks of reading Ada or Arter are coming back to me. I definitely think that all of this illusion and deep cuts of the culture that he is familiar with can come off as really pretentious. I think you kind of have to be in the right frame of mind in order to read Nabokov. But that being said, over time, I've kind of appreciated the level of engagement that I need to have when I read a Nabokov work. I think this interactivity is what makes it so easy to get obsessed with Vladimir Nabokov. I come back over and over to that quote where he says that real literature isn't something to be gulped down like a potion. You have to pull it apart, macerate it, really think about it so that the end result involves something of the reader himself or herself. It's a synthesis, not a one-way street from the author to the reader. I have come to really like that interactivity, and I would recommend Vladimir Nabokov to anyone who wants to be stimulated, who wants to be provoked and challenged in their reading, who's not afraid of moral ambiguity and who has an open mind, somebody who wants to really engage with a work of art. Thanks so much for following along with this video. I know it's been kind of long, but I have a lot of things to say about Vladimir Nabokov, and I would invite you to put them in the comments if you have any other thoughts about Vladimir Nabokov's themes. Thanks, and bye.